Welcome to Dev Interrupted. I'm your host, Andrew Ziegler.
And I'm your host, Ben Lloyd Pearson. This week, we're talking about the latest in a series of ThoughtWork memos on AI and the increasing divide between executive employees on their AI usage. But I think, Angie, you had something you wanted to bring up first.
Oh, yes. So, a little birdie told me that you got a lot of attention on social media in the last week or two. And when you and I chatted about it, it seems like it happened when you didn't have any phone service. Do you want to
Yeah,
talk about it?
it was a little fun. So I posted this article about Sam Altman saying that U.S. copyright law is holding back AI, and I designed it to be a little inflammatory. I'm going to admit that, but still think I made a good point. But it's funny because I posted it right before I left on vacation and checked my cell phone like many hours later when it had hundreds of comments, and of course had to turn off notifications. But my controversial opinions on copyright set aside, I seem to have waded into like the front lines of this brewing conflict that I've seen not just on my own page, but elsewhere on social media. And that is between creative professionals and software developers. So, people that are in these creative lines of work, like designers, musicians, artists, they are really starting to witness a lot of the disruptive effects of AI. But unlike professions like software development, they don't really seem to be receiving a whole lot of the benefits that it brings along with it. So, you think about software developers, like they really are experiencing a lot of like things that accelerate, that help improve quality, that help them learn new things. And the benefits have been way more substantial for people. But in the background, we've also kind of covered in the past how like Chinese companies are now entering this space, and they have zero obligation to respect Western copyright. So I kind of have every reason to believe that this disruption that creative professionals are feeling right now probably only going to continue to grow. Like even if Sam Altman and others can't train their models on copyrighted content. And I wore my fixed copyright shirt today because this really matters. This is a matter I can talk way too long about, and most people's eyes just glaze over. But I hope one thing we can actually agree on is that today's copyright laws really do need to be rethought because I just simply don't think they're going to work in the AI era. Like the AI was never anticipated when copyright was created.
Isn't it funny how timing works? How, you can post any other time while you're at work or dedicated to being online and you don't get much attention, but then you post something and YOLO, throw your phone to the side and you disconnect from the world and you come back
Yeah.
and suddenly everyone's pointing at you and you have all this unwanted attention.
And
It's funny how it works.
I thought I wasn't even gonna post this one, and I just did it because, like, why not? I was like, "It's content that I wrote, might as well post it."
Something you mentioned about, people in creative work, they're feeling the disruptive effects of AI, but they're not really feeling a lot of the benefits. I think this really underscores a lot of the disconnect right now that I see between techs and creatives.
Yeah.
As someone in more of like a creative role who works in tech, I feel like I'm often stuck between two opposing worldviews a lot of the time when I talk about how I work or what I do. And I know many others are in similar positions. And something I've noticed is that when we use AI for knowledge work in tech, we say context is king. That's what drives good copywriting, good code, good decision management across,
Mhm.
multiple iterations. But when you're using AI for creative work, cohesion is king. That means that the changes we want to apply with AI need to match the rest of the piece or what we had in mind for it. Otherwise, it's really hard to iterate. And this is a completely different set of problems and solutions. In painting is one of these ways that technologists working with AI to do creative work can change things, but there's still so much to tap into and explore. And that cohesion ultimately is what relates that piece with everything else. You see a Van Gogh, it's Van Gogh because of the brushstrokes, and it's an impressionist painting because of how those brushstrokes relate to each other. But since tech is really loud and proud about sharing their AI usage in the open, we're better at facilitating those strategies for context. But creatives, they're in a world where they're not talking much about that usage, unless maybe they're dismissing it or disparaging it. There's a large polarizing view on it. As a result, they don't share those strategies for cohesion. They aren't actually able to utilize AI as an artistic assistant in a parallel to how we can use it in tech. So that's just something that I've kind of been noodling on as I think about what is the root of these differences between how folks use these tools. Obviously, there's other concerns here involved in the conversations around copyright and the models that do diffusion and what they're
Yeah,
trained on
absolutely.
that are the root of a lot of issues with how artists view the usage of technology. And that goes back to your copyright. That said, it doesn't help that ultimately they also lack the tools to see the success. They're seeing a different world than we are.
Yeah, have been wondering, like, is this almost like a macrocosm of what we similar trends that we're seeing in software development? Like, some teams are really quick to embrace the benefits of AI, and have, sort of accelerated their work because of it, while others, maybe that are doing things that are like tasks that are more like programming rather than software development. Like, they're seeing more disruption and they're seeing fewer of the benefits to the point where, I think even like, I don't think AI is going to take all software developers' jobs, but there are many jobs within software development that it certainly will. And if your entire job is one of those things, then similarly, you may feel a type of disruption without the benefits of AI.
Very much, very
But
much.
speaking of AI disruption, let's talk about our next topic because it comes from a former guest on our show that I think has brilliant ideas, and I always love reading her work. So, what's this story about?
Oh, yes. So this story is the latest memo actually in a series of memos from ThoughtWorks. This latest memo is from Brigitte Bokler, who, like you mentioned, was a guest on Dev Interrupted back in November. Some of y'all might remember, if you're longtime listeners, she talked about how we are making sense of agentic AI. Well, Brigitte is back with an article that explores the evolving role of developers as AI-powered coding assistants become more capable and more prevalent. It points out how they can enhance productivity, but it requires constant oversight. And if you've been listening to Dev Interrupted, we've heard this again and again and again from leaders in the space that are using this
Absolutely.
tool about how it creates so much opportunity, but it also creates so much disruption. And it can really impact things like your time to commit, your team flow, and the maintainability of your code. There's a lot of examples in here in terms of actual applied usage that the author used as she went through different iterations of different tools and what were the problems in her usual process that she encountered along the way. And it's really a hallmark of course, ThoughtWorks memos. It's very easy to understand, but it's also cut straight to the core of how an actual technologist would use these tools. Ben, do you want to maybe talk about some of the things that stood out from the article to you?
Yeah, and I want to call out that our producer Adam mentioned I believe this is the first guest that I ever interviewed on Dev Interrupted, so topic definitely holds a place dear to my heart. But the thing that I really love about Brigitte is how she always focuses on very practical examples about the current state of AI. So this is like cutting edge perspective on what AI is capable of, and why that's so important is because this stuff is shifting so rapidly that I really think she is one of the best voices at keeping everyone in the know about the progress that AI development platforms are making. And there's a couple of points that she made that really stand out to me. And the first is I'm going to quote second. She said, "By no stretch of personal imagination will we have AI that writes 90% of our code autonomously in a year." So I love that really bold statement from her. She does also
Yeah.
say that, maybe it will assist in writing 90% of your code in some circumstances. She claims that about 80% of her development is AI assisted, which is like really awesome to hear. And I expect she's probably pretty far at, like on the leading edge of that, just given the nature of her work. And one of the like critical recommendations that I picked up from this that she recommends stepping away from GPT sessions when they start to feel out of control. And
Yes.
this sort of echoes my experience. Like most GPT sessions are like ephemeral to me. Like I spin them up when I need them, and then the moment my problem is solved, I forget about them forever and just like basically throw them to the wayside. And so, and I think really what we need to take away from this is that engineering leaders, like, you can't get complacent about AI assisted code. You need to maintain discipline around basic code quality standards. And it's important that people are trained on those things and that they understand and agree with the practices that you're implementing.
Big plus one to the idea of throwing the chat away when it stops helping you or it stops making
Yeah.
sense. That's one of the biggest strategies and pieces of advice I've given to people always about using a tool like AI is that Ultimately, if you're fighting it and it's not helping you, step back, start over. And that's a really great observation here from her. It really kind of underscores how, those LLM basics really carry you through this whole process, and everyone needs to be doing the upskilling work to really understand how this stuff works. So really great article. Really looking forward to the next memo on the topic because I know it's an evolving subject.
Yeah, definitely all the listeners need to head to the show notes, read this article, a lot of great advice. And I do also want to mention that we didn't get to cover it in this episode because it's a little bit bigger than what we were prepared to cover, but the ThoughtWorks Technology Radar just came out. It's a twice annual publication. Always has lots of great insights about the who's who of software development tools. So go check it out. Just came out like I think last week.
Yep.
So what's our last story for today, Andrew?
Yes, our last story for today is looking deeper at the divide inside of companies between executives and their own employees about how they perceive their AI usage and its impact on the work that they do. There were some really standout quotes and statistics from this article. There were a bunch of posts about it as well from a LinkedIn survey that found that less than half of employees, 45% of them, think that their company's AI rollout in the last 12 months has been successful. And what makes this such
Wow.
a powerful statistic is that that's compared to the 75% of C-suite who thought that it went well. So there's people
Wow.
that there's a big divide here between employees and how they're perceiving the usage of their AI tools within their company and the impact of it, and their executives. Only 57% of employees say that their company even has an AI strategy, but 88% of C-suite believes that their company do. So there's
Oh my
also
gosh.
clearly a misalignment between what's the reality within these companies.
So that's
Um,
what, about a 50% divide between employee perception and executives? Like, that's huge.
Yeah, it's pretty stark, especially when you realize, as part of this survey as well, as it goes back to this 2024 LinkedIn report that said that 53% of employees were still hiding their AI usage from employers for the fear they would make them look replaceable. And so it's really about this really underscores how within large companies, small companies alike, there's still a really big disconnect between these two worlds. And there's still so much work to be done to bring them closer together with conversations about how this technology is actually impacting us. Were there other things that stood out to you as well, Ben, in this article?
Yeah, well, I love the hiding AI usage from your employer. As somebody who formerly maintained a whole bunch of shadow IT infrastructure, I can't officially condone that practice, but I do understand the motivations. But, like what I see is this like massive, stark divide between employee and executive perception on AI that frankly is shocking. I mean, in this article I read, like there's pushback from employees on AI specifically over a fear of being replaced. Like
Mhm.
that's kind of gross. There's backlash against executives that claim that AI bots should be in the company org chart, which, let's just put this aside for a minute. Like, I think that's like a gross misunderstanding of how AI is actually going to work in the typical organization. Like, it's not going to be this like all encompassing employee that does everything that a human can do.
Right.
Um, but then there's also like employees sabotaging AI rollouts by just refusing to adopt it. Like
Yep.
my favorite quote from this was it said, "We're all sick of the effing chatbots. Don't ask me to use another chatbot."
Hey,
So
that's pretty understandable. Everything getting shoved into a chat interface these days definitely adds a lot of fatigue.
yeah, I mean the chat is yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. Chat is not a great it's an okay interface for AI. It's not the best. But, in this survey, actually, it applies to like a pretty wide range of knowledge work, but I really think it is representative of something that we also encounter in the engineering world, and that is unstructured AI adoption. So when you give your team AI tools without fully understanding their needs or providing training on how to use AI, you're setting yourself up for chaos, like what is described in this article. And like I mentioned, chat is not the best interface for AI. Like instead of chatbots, you should be thinking about how to deploy agents that are custom built for your workflows. So I call this like the tokenization of knowledge work. So focus on breaking work down into atomic units that are small enough for purpose built AI agents to solve with high precision and high accuracy. And of course, you need guardrails on AI too. There's a robust deterministic processes and tools that out there that come in handy. Use CI/CD to enforce quality practices, implement static analysis. Like, don't rely 100% on human judgment to maintain AI oversight.
Yep, really well said, especially about breaking work down into the small units. I know you've seen a lot of success with it. I have as well. That's one of my biggest pieces of advice for folks right now is knowledge workers. Look at the things that you're doing that you're repeating over and over again. Those are
Yeah.
the things that you can solve with these ephemeral one-off types of solutions or chats. There's a lot of potential there for saving time.
Yep. Exactly. So tell me about our guest today, Andrew.
Oh, yeah. So after the break, we're bringing Brooke Hartley Moy on the pod. She's the CEO and co founder of Infactory. And Brooke's work focuses on improving the trustworthiness of AI. Because after all, what good are tools if you can't predict how they'll work? So stick around for this fun chat. It's really going to be a great one. Today, we're diving into one of the most critical challenges for engineering leaders: how to build accurate AI systems that actually work in the real world. Joining me is Brooke Hartley Moy, CEO and co founder of Infactory. Brooke has an impressive background spanning companies like Humane, Samsung, and Google, and now she's leading a company dedicated to solving one of the toughest problems in AI: trustworthiness. Brooke, welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here.
It's so great to have you, and we have lots to discuss, so let's go ahead and jump in. And the first thing I want to talk about is the speed of everything. AI is moving crazy fast, and it feels like some businesses just aren't ready for it. But week after week, we're seeing new businesses and industries jump into LLMs, maybe without even having solid data practices or clear goals. Sometimes we don't even get a clear sense they understand what the LLM can or can't do. And I know you've seen this firsthand as well. What is the biggest misconception that you think companies have around AI right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've really been at the front lines of this. I certainly have in the roles I've played before in Factory and now in terms of seeing companies trying to use LLMs to solve every single challenge that they might have as a business. And, to use a trade expression, it's a little bit of a square peg into a round hole situation in some cases. LLMs are this really magical technology. Like, I'm fully AI optimist, excited about what LLMs can do, but they also aren't the end all be all solution or the silver bullet I think that people have come to treat them as. And not every single AI challenge or even just business challenge, take AI out of it. Not every business challenge should be solved directly with just your run of the mill LLM or even a super powerful LLM.
And when you get down to it, in brass tacks, what do you think an LM is actually really good at for most businesses?
Yeah, it's in the name if you think about generative AI, which is really the kind of AI that we're talking about that LLMs power. AI is sort of a catch-all now, but we're really talking about one field within AI or within machine learning. Generative AI, LLMs are good at the generative side. They're very good at being creative. They're very good at content creation. We've seen that in, models that produce images and videos and how much those have progressed in a short time. I'm sure many people have already experimented with things like email writing or blog posts or, the
Right.
New York Times just announced within the last 24 hours that they were going to use their own internal tool for helping with article creation, research, doing headlines, not going so far as to produce an entire article directly from AI, but to support that process. They're honestly a very great creative helper. That's really where they shine. If you want to produce something sort of net new and kind of go off into territory that feels unfamiliar and potentially coming straight from the artificial brain of an LLM, you're going to get pretty good results at this point from any LLM based tool.
I agree. It's really helpful for getting over the blank page and getting
Yeah,
started
the
with
cold
some
start
kind of
problem.
right, like some kind of critical mass to get you going. Sometimes you just need to see what you don't like to know what you do. And when I think you and I can both agree that people playing around with AI and innovating with new things, there's no shortage of ideas or things that you could do to maybe change your workflows with the tool. But when you get the result from it, out of one of the ends, how can you really start to build trust in what you're getting out of your LLMs or your AIs? Because to us, it kind of just seems like a black box.
Completely. And I mean, that's somewhat by design. And this kind of goes into the topic of what are LLMs not good at, which is they are inherently, to the black box problem, they're not really that explainable. It's not very easy to understand where a decision came from. And in some ways, you wouldn't necessarily want to tamp down on that if you're thinking about the use cases that we just talked about. Like if you want the LM to give you that creativity, help you with the blank page in front of you and to start to sort of spark ideation and all of that, you don't want to have it completely locked down to only work with, completely vetted, verified answers and obvious sort of delineation between, source data and other things. Uh, but when you're talking about other use cases that people are now increasingly trying to apply AI for, particularly in the enterprise, and across much more critical use cases, that's where the black box problem really becomes an issue. And that's where, at the end of the day, it's really about data. If you are going to trust the output of an LLM or the output of any AI tool, you want to know that it's being trained on the right data, that it is, if it's doing any kind of RAG flow, any kind of additional grounding, that data itself is trustworthy and verified. And you want to be able to have some exposure to like what are those decisions that it's being making behind the scenes in order to come to its answer. We're seeing this more and more, like Operator, the newest kind of forms of deep research that OpenAI has put out, an Operator on the Anthropic side. All of them are trying to expose more of at least the LLM's thinking. It just still doesn't solve the problem completely of trust, though, because at the end of the day, the LM is still going to be inherently probabilistic in its response.
Right, exactly. So what I'm hearing is that the stakes and the quality of the data, if the stakes are high, then the quality of the data needs to be high. I've heard this from other guests as well, and that seems to be a really big trend where when you're establishing trust, if the stakes are high, the data quality and the amount of information that's feeding into that decision making, it also needs to be high. And so when you're talking about large enterprises, maybe ones that are typically really regulated, have a lot of restrictions, maybe we don't typically view them as like a digital company. There's a very traditional
Right.
enterprises that are sprawling, and you see them picking up these tools now every week. Very recently we talked about Goldman Sachs and how they adopted AI practices within their corporation. And so when you talk about the data quality and being able to use the data, how can enterprises that don't typically have a strong data practice actually get good usage out of LLMs with their data? Like, where do they start?
Yes, it's a great question. It's funny because it's a question that we've been asking for a really long time that certainly predates anything related to LLMs or even, predates people knowing what an LLM even was. Big data was sort of the moniker of its time. And I've been around the software industry long enough to have heard many conversations around how do we turn what is essentially this massive cost center of messy, siloed, not particularly well managed and clean data into something meaningful. And there's been kind of various stages of technology that have come around to try to address that. I think the advantage we have now going into sort of the AI era to help these companies that you mentioned that are often more in the legacy side or have not potentially even gone through the full evolution of, moving to the cloud or using things like data lakehouses or the other solutions that have sort of come to pass, is you don't necessarily need now to clean up every single piece of data that is, in your current corpus. You can actually leverage AI, and this is something that we've been really focused on in Factory, to really understand like what data is worth investing in, like what data is going to answer the queries that are most meaningful to your business. Like where are the nuggets of gold hidden in what is essentially like, this desert of otherwise valuable, but maybe not so valuable information. And I think a big focus on that is then how do you set that up in such a way that the LLM can understand that data and then that an application can understand that data, that you can use it and get the information that you're looking for. That's a big focus on what we're doing in Infactory, which is essentially on the data preparation side, making LLMs enterprise friendly by helping with this sort of data layer and addressing how do you make this data more useful in an AI context, recognizing that like there are huge advantages to that now. But you have to at least take that first step to get them into that stage.
Right. And so not all data is made equal, and some of it is gonna be more important. And I think that's a native instinct most people have when they approach data, especially engineering data or things around like finances. Like some things are just more important to look at and understand. And you really highlight, I think for me, what I think is the anxiety when people think about the evolution of AI rapidly within large organizations. And you talk about like the big data, and being able to analyze what you have, and that was already a problem that we had before AI got on the scene. Companies were already sitting on troves of data, more than they knew what to do with. And they were already going through processes of, having the data warehouse, the data lake house, go through all these different evolutions of how to access it. So when you're talking about the nuggets of gold, and maybe you're somebody who's trying to find those nuggets of gold, obviously they tie back to your business, but how can you really start a data forward practice within your organization to make sure those nuggets of gold are always getting found?
I think it doesn't require nearly the heavy lifting that I think people expect. I think part of it is recognizing that there are probably, I don't know, 100 different queries in a larger organization that covers 90% of what a business would actually want to know. And so when we talk about big data, I often kind of laugh a little bit about it because yes, there is a lot of data. Corporations have more data than they know what to do with, and they're producing more, every second. And it's like the giant waste pile like moving around the Pacific Ocean, and it's how I kind of picture it in my head of like all of this data that's just accumulating. But
Yes.
mostly it's just how do you get down to at a very granular, precise level the few things that really matter. And AI really does enable that in a way that we haven't been able to do before. That's a lot of what we've been focused on over the last few months is this idea that if you can understand even just 100 queries and get the right answers to those queries, you probably have made like a huge stride forward in being able to get the things that actually matter out of your data, rather than trying to sort of what has been historically the approach, because we haven't had this level of precision. We haven't had like scalpel level precision of
Right.
trying to just turn everything into a data asset. That it's not practical, nor is it really necessary. It's a massive drain on time and cost and resources. And so businesses should be leveraging AI differently, and data engineers need to be thinking about this in terms of how do I actually focus on the things that matter. AI is really making that possible.
I think that's a big unlock because AI is really, at the end of the day, about focus. We talk about that a lot on this show about what AI gives you is not necessarily the end result, but the ability to focus on the higher level things that the AI can't do. And the same thing has always been true about data. You draw a really good visual image, I think, of maybe having like a giant trash island of data. It's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's the size of
Sorry for
Texas.
that image. It really, it's not. It's visceral, but maybe
It's
not the most
visceral, but
pleasant one.
so real. It's because in that environment, that data, just like the trash that's kind of going in and out, it's cycling through. There's a lot of stuff coming in and out, and you're building on top of it. And so really the key is if you're going to build on top of what we think is like this like layer in the ocean, you got to build fast, you got to be innovative, you got to look at what's there and be inventive, but also decisive. And so if you're a team and you're trying to innovate in that kind of environment, you have a lot of data, you have a lot of hypotheses, AI is giving you focus. How can you start iterating to get to the core of the problem we've talked about, which is trust?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's an interesting time for people in the development space. I always say to give another visual, it feels a little bit like building on quicksand because the
Mm,
pace is really fast, right? Like what was cutting edge even just a few months ago already starts to feel obsolete pretty quickly. The ethics are constantly changing. That we've got publishers suing some AI tools while other publishers are playing nicely and doing deals. We've got DeepSeek. I think if you had told me that that was going to happen, it's like that was definitely not on my 2025 bingo card. And so staying up to date with all of those things is really challenging. I think that the way that developers are going to succeed with the trust element is that, first of all, like, trust is the only thing that is really going to matter at a foundational level. In order for AI to have any meaningful impact on the enterprise and, honestly, at society at large, people have to believe that the outputs are, one, accurate and reliable, but two, that they're based on outcomes that ultimately have net benefit, as opposed to risks and dangers sort of embedded in the system. And in my mind, like, what I've seen succeed for people that are building in this space is just relentless focus on that idea that you want to be working with high quality data. You want to be building with the mindset of, how do I make this as reliable as possible for my end user? And I want to expose as much as possible for my end user. I want to make them sort of pull back as much of the black box as possible. Um, I feel like the winners in this space in a time of so much evolution and change are the ones that kind of are going to keep all of those principles top of mind in the trust arena.
I like the idea of building on quicksand. It's going to be constantly shifting underneath you. It's a changing environment, and you've given some solid advice for how you can plan for things that you maybe can't even predict. AI is moving really fast. We're trying to hit moving targets and build things that are not going to be obsolete in 6 months. And we don't want to make the wrong decisions that are going to cost our employers a lot of money or our team a lot of advantage. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, and that pressure and trust, they work in a balance with each other, because you want to trust as much as possible, but you also have to be able to keep up with competition. So it's a constant dance between them. And so when we get to this world where we're building with LLMs, and we're able to build trust from what we get out of them, I want to search here for a really good insight for our audience that comes from like an engineering management background. They're trying to implement their data practices, these data practices that you're talking about, with AI workflows. A lot of teams right now have mandates from their organizations to create these workflows right now, to experiment with AI. And so how can those engineering leaders partner with their non-technical leaders and help them build that trust, but also help build impact?
Completely. Yeah. I think this goes actually back to sort of the top of our conversation, which is, where are LLMs effective and where they are not? And I think one area that has been sort of deeply uh, underutilized as far as attention, has not gotten the primary focus, is solutions and offerings that complement the LLM. And that, because I think business leaders, and particularly non-technical business leaders, do see LLMs as sort of this panacea to anything that they want to throw at it, it's sort of on the engineering manager's plate to figure out how to complement the LLM with other techniques and ML offerings that bring a level of determinism into the process. I think it's going to be a tall order to convince people that maybe we need to slow down the pace of LLM adoption. I think the genie's out of the bottle a little bit there now that people have some general understanding of what these technologies can do. But I think that there's a role for engineering managers to play in terms of pushing for features that support LLM usage in a safe and trustworthy way. And so that includes things like, obviously, evaluation. I think evaluation is increasingly less important, because the models are becoming commoditized. How much one model is that different from another? But I think there are other features and efforts that engineering managers can take in the area of guardrails, obviously, attribution, and bring in some sense of sort of data lineage and explainability. Anyone right now that's building in the explainability space, I think, is on the right track, and engineers looking at some of those tools and how they might leverage them. But I think it's about defining a full tech stack and architecture that isn't just LLM application. I think most engineering managers have certainly gone past that understanding at this point. But it's about, okay, what goes in between. RAG has been sort of the technique of choice, at least for the last year. Now we're moving into much more agentic, autonomous view of the world where it's not just about search and retrieval, it's about actual action. That's also going to depend on like the quality of the data that the agent's retrieving. You can't trust an agent to go out and do something on your behalf if you don't believe that it's accessing things that are ultimately correct and worth trusting. And so those are those are the areas in which I feel like engineering managers have a role to play in terms of defining the safety and the trust that's going to be built into their AI systems going forward and to help bring business leaders along on that journey.
This is a really great playbook, and I like how you break down the mysticism of LLMs, kind of like how maybe companies talked about the cloud. They were like, "Oh, we'll solve that with the cloud." But the cloud is a component of parts, and
Right.
it's an orchestration of a system, and engineers have specializations even within the cloud to understand how to get the most out of it. And the same could be true for adopting something like LLMs or AI into a workflow. It's just one component, and it has to work in tandem with things like data quality, understanding the business problem. And I like that word. Like I like that phrase, data lineage, of being able to track and understand the authenticity and building with that up front. And so if you're one of these engineering leaders and if you're trying to start building these muscles, these are new muscles, people
Right.
haven't built in these ways before. You've given us some really good habits, I think, to start with, like around data practices. Are there any other habits that you'd recommend in this new AI native world?
I think a few. One is, I think if you are building in the AI space, it is the builder ultimately your responsibility to understand what outcomes your what basically everything comes down at this point to a query level. What outcomes are your queries driving? And so what I mean by that is that we've sort of been talking about the first step in the process, right? Data quality, the foundation layer, what exactly are the services, and if it's a search service, if it's a bot, if it's an agent, if it's what application, whatever, what are the things that is supplying that foundation, both in the training of a model, the fine tuning, the grounding, all of that. But now, particularly as we're moving, as I mentioned, into this much more autonomous agentic space where humans are unlikely to be always in the loop. At least, um, that's the dream, the vision, what we're all striving for, at least, or at least some people are. Some people I know are a little afraid of that. I think you also then need to understand at a very clear level what are the steps that you've built up to that point. What actions are they going to induce? So I think something that's, we've experienced this firsthand in some of my previous jobs is that we had a certain expectation that, say, that we had built an AI agent to order food from DoorDash. And we had a certain expectation of how that would work. And you kind of started testing and you put into the world. There's a whole set of strange edge cases that you can't predict if you haven't done the work of sort of fully going end to end and understanding that it's like, oh, well, like what happens if, the restaurant's closed? What happens if the driver doesn't show up the way that they're supposed to? What happens if this item is no longer in the menu? All of those different scenarios. And I feel like something that, like, operating in this new world, usually it's like you build an application, you take in data about its usage, you kind of understand each of those elements, you have some control over that. That whole playbook is completely out. And so something that I feel like people are sort of skipping right now that are in sort of the early stages is really taking the process end to end and like pausing to understand what are the outcomes that I'm actually driving towards, and do I have then each of the steps in place to allow a successful outcome to happen.
That makes a lot of sense. Your example too makes me smile. The idea of having to innovate on all the edge cases when doing something like ordering a pizza. That's so
It
true.
I
But
I feel
also,
that I feel that acutely whenever I watch the, ads, for Salesforce's Agent Force, where Matthew McConaughey is sitting
oh
in the
yes.
rain because an agent didn't book his table, and I always think of like, yes, but obviously the hostess wouldn't have just sat him in the rain. This is actually an area where a human would do that more effectively than an AI, because a human would just see that it's raining. And so
Right.
I'm like, that's a really great example in my mind of why agents are actually not quite ready for prime time and the work that you need to do to cover all of those scenarios. Because if we were actually ready for the agent to sit people at tables, we would have to plan for those things, and they might not be very good at it relative to just the hostess who can see that it's raining.
There's a lot of hidden inputs that we take for granted as humans. Like, we can glance outside, we can know it's
Right.
raining. If you're like
Right.
me, your elbow kind of creaks when it's raining, so like when it's raining. And so, but an LLM doesn't have a creaky elbow, and it can't look outside. It might be able to query the weather channel or otherwise get some weather data for you, but probably can't fully predict if it's raining. And also your example is great because it talks about stakes again. We're talking about the stakes of what you're trying to do. That example, brings a smile to my face about ordering a pizza and all the things that could go wrong. Well, what if you're trying to use an LLM during maybe it's used as part of like any kind of like medical booking process. Imagine it trying to make a decision or a flow otherwise around trying to get proper medical care. When you start implementing it into higher stakes workflows, you have to have done your homework and understand how things can go wrong. And I think that ultimately comes from domain expertise. Yeah.
Completely. Well, this is an area too where I often butt heads with others in the industry who take the viewpoint that, innovation for innovation's sake is always a good idea and that we should move as quickly as possible. And, people who are not quite ready to embrace the AI revolution are, you know, too set in a certain worldview that it's about to be completely upended, all of these other things. And as I said, I am an AI optimist. I'm not afraid of robot overlords. I believe that this is ultimately going to be a net positive for humanity. But where I do butt heads with others in my industry and disagree is there are so many use cases right now where like close enough is just not good enough. And you mentioned healthcare, there are many others, finance, manufacturing, anything where the stakes are more than just did your table get sat in the rain or did you order a pizza? And I think a lot of folks have sort of looked at the LLMs as sort of this magical tool and have had positive experience with LLMs and see that the models are improving and see that they're getting closer and closer to perfect accuracy, but they're not at perfect accuracy. And, within that, whatever it is, even if it's 0.1%, it's certainly not a 0.1%. I mean, I think for many things there, it's closer to more like, 20% of the time you're not quite getting a high quality answer, even if it's not a full hallucination. Those are That's problematic. The space for edge cases is then just significant and gets exponential, and the stakes are just too high. And, we talk to a lot of enterprises who would benefit from the use of AI, but can't take the full risk of it's completely autonomous and all decisions are being driven out of an AI system. There has to be a range. And, I gotta go to back to the New York Times example. I mean, they clearly have decided that it's worth augmenting the performance of their, journalists, but it is not worth creating other articles with AI because there's still a degree in which human expertise is going to matter.
I completely agree. It's about understanding the levels and also the nuances within your business and how to best leverage it, but also how to get like the most reliable results. And that's why I'm so grateful for this conversation because you've given us such a really like thorough playbook on understanding at the beginning how data impacts trust and how you can build impact through your systems by understanding what goes into them. We talked a bit about building in uncertainty and being able to innovate. And ultimately, we keep circling this point of talking about the stakes, which is really, really great. It's a really powerful takeaway that, in our audience, I know a lot of our listeners, they really resonate with that. We're talking about folks who work in engineering industries that are on and that are in scenarios where, everything needs to be taken into account. And if something goes wrong, those stakes are really big. So when you're weighing, all of the pressure of implementing AI in this scenario, it's really great to get, perspectives like yours and kind of understand how other teams are doing it. And before we wrap up, I know you were talking about some of your opinions on AI and where we're going as like a world. And where can our audience, where can they go to learn more about you and Infactory?
Yeah. So infactory.ai would be the first place to start. If you message us, I see everything that comes through. So even though we're working with large enterprises, I take a direct interest in particular with what the developer community is doing and what engineers are working on. And we've really built this entire product with developers top of mind because we've lived that, right? Like we've seen the challenges of what it takes to build high stakes AI, the challenges that come from business leaders who think that LMs can solve all their problems. And we really want to help folks that are building in this space who believe that there's a way to do this that's trustworthy and effective. So, um, I love engaging with people that are building cool and interesting things who want to build it in a way that feels inherently safe and important.
Awesome. We'll make sure we get that link in the show notes for our listeners. I also recommend to our listeners check out Brooke on LinkedIn. I've been following Brooke for a little while. I love her posts. They're really fun and insightful. And just like this conversation, Brooke is always talks like a human in an AI world. So it's great to get a perspective that's like deeply resonant with what's going on. And that's it for today's episode. And to you, our loyal listener, thanks for making it this far. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, check it out, our Substack if you haven't already. Send this to anyone you may know who could get something out of today's episode. We'd also love to hear from you on socials. So come bug us, come poke us, come leave us a nice comment. I'd love to hear what y'all are thinking. And see you next time.